In November 1918, a 29-year-old soldier lay in a military hospital in Pasewalk, Germany. His eyes had been injured in a gas attack on the Belgian front. As he recovered in darkness, news arrived that would change his life forever. Germany had surrendered. The war was over, and Germany had lost. According to his own later account, the young man buried his head in his pillow and wept for the first time since his mother died. In that moment of despair and rage, something crystallized in his mind. Someone had to be responsible for this catastrophe. Someone had betrayed the fatherland. That soldier was Adolf Hitler, and the explanation he seized upon would lead to the murder of 6 million Jews. But the question remains, why did Hitler hate the Jews? The answer is far more complex than a single moment of revelation in a hospital bed. It's a story that begins years earlier in the streets of Vienna, takes shape amid the chaos of a defeated Germany, and culminates in an ideology so poisonous that it would consume an entire continent. Adolf Hitler was born in 1889 in Braunau am Inn, a small Austrian town on the German border. His childhood gave little indication of what was to come. His father, a customs official, was strict and distant. His mother, Clara, doted on her son. When she died of breast cancer in December 1907, the 18-year-old Hitler was devastated. The family physician who treated Clara was Dr. Eduard Bloch, a Jewish doctor who had shown kindness and compassion to both mother and son. Hitler was grateful for Bloch's care, and the two maintained a respectful relationship. Years later, after the Nazi takeover of Austria, Hitler personally ensured that Dr. Bloch and his wife were exempt from many anti-Semitic laws and allowed to emigrate safely. This detail matters because it contradicts a popular myth that Hitler's hatred of Jews stemmed from resentment toward a Jewish doctor who treated his mother. The evidence simply doesn't support that story. After his mother's death, Hitler moved to Vienna with dreams of becoming an artist. He applied twice to the Academy of Fine Arts and was rejected both times. His drawings were technically adequate, but lacked originality and passion. The Academy judged him better suited to architecture than painting, but Hitler lacked the formal education required for architectural studies. This rejection was crushing. Hitler had envisioned himself as a great artist, and Vienna had denied him that future. He spent the next several years drifting through the city, surviving on a modest inheritance from his parents. By 1909, that money had run out. Hitler found himself living in homeless shelters and men's hostels, selling small watercolor postcards to tourists to earn enough money for food and lodging. Vienna during this period was a city of contradictions. It was the glittering capital of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, a center of art, music, and culture. It was also a city seething with ethnic tensions and political upheaval. The empire contained dozens of different nationalities and languages, all competing for power and recognition within the imperial system. The city had a large and visible Jewish population, approximately 175,000 people, or about 8.6% of Vienna's residents. Many were recent arrivals from the eastern provinces of the empire, particularly Galicia. These Eastern European Jews, known as Ostjuden, were visibly different from assimilated Viennese Jews. They wore traditional clothing, spoke Yiddish, and maintained orthodox religious practices. Their arrival had sparked resentment even among established Jewish families who had already integrated into Viennese society. The contrast between different Jewish communities in Vienna was stark. Assimilated Jews had become prominent in the city's professional classes, in medicine, law, journalism, and the arts. They spoke German, dressed in contemporary fashion, and participated fully in Viennese cultural life. Some had converted to Christianity. Many considered themselves German first and Jewish second, if at all. The composer Gustav Mahler, who served as director of the Vienna Court Opera until 1907, exemplified this integration. Despite facing anti-Semitic opposition, Mahler was widely regarded as one of the great musical figures of the age. But the arrival of poor traditional Jews from the East disrupted this comfortable narrative of assimilation. The Ostjuden were desperately poor, many fleeing economic hardship or pogroms in Russia and Galicia. They settled in Vienna's poorest districts, establishing their own communities, religious institutions, and customs. Their visible difference, their poverty, and their numbers made them easy targets for anti-Semitic agitation. Vienna's boulevards and cafes showcase the empire's wealth and sophistication, but in the tenements and working-class districts where Hitler lived, conditions were harsh. Overcrowding was common. Disease spread easily. Competition for work was fierce. In these circumstances, Blaming outsiders for economic problems came natural, and Jews, particularly the newly arrived Eastern European Jews, represented convenient scapegoats. But Hitler's Vienna years didn't immediately produce the rabid anti-Semitism he would later claim. In fact, the evidence suggests a more complicated picture. Hitler shared rooms in men's hostels with Jewish acquaintances. He sold his paintings primarily through Jewish art dealers, who were often the only ones willing to help a struggling artist with no connections or reputation. A Jewish copper dealer named Siegfried Löwner occasionally bought Hitler's work, as did a Jewish picture framer named Samuel Morgenstern. Most significantly, Hitler developed a business partnership with Reinhold Hanisch, who was not Jewish, and later with Josef Neumann, who was. Neumann, a Jewish cloth merchant, helped Hitler sell his paintings, and the two maintained a cordial working relationship until Neumann left Vienna in 1910. If Hitler harbored deep anti-Semitic convictions at this time, his behavior suggests otherwise. He was pragmatic enough to work with Jewish businessmen when it served his interests. So when did Hitler's anti-Semitism actually develop? The answer appears to be gradually, and not in the way he later described. Vienna itself provided the intellectual environment where anti-Semitic ideas flourished. Two politicians in particular shaped the city's political culture during Hitler's time there, and both left deep impressions on the young, struggling artist. The first was Georg Ritter von Schonerer, a radical German nationalist who believed that the German-speaking regions of Austria-Hungary should be incorporated into the German Empire. Schonerer advocated a particularly virulent form of racial anti-Semitism. He argued that Jews could never be true Germans, regardless of how well they assimilated, or even if they converted to Christianity. For Schonerer, Jewishness was a matter of blood, not belief. This was a crucial shift from earlier religious anti-Semitism, which at least theoretically allowed for conversion and acceptance. Schonerer's influence extended beyond politics. He promoted the concept of the Aryan race, drawing on pseudo-scientific theories that were gaining popularity across Europe. He rejected any Jewish participation in German cultural or political life. His movement included rituals and symbols that emphasized Germanic paganism and rejected Christianity as a Jewish-influenced religion. Though Schonerer's political career collapsed after he was imprisoned for violent behavior, his ideas continued to circulate in Vienna's nationalist circles. The second major influence was Karl Lueger, who served as mayor of Vienna from 1897 until his death in 1910. Lueger was a different kind of anti-Semite, more pragmatic and opportunistic than ideological. He understood that anti-Semitism could be an effective political tool. Lueger combined anti-Jewish rhetoric with populist social reforms that benefited working-class and lower-middle-class Viennese. He modernized the city's infrastructure, expanded public services, and positioned himself as a champion of ordinary people against wealthy elites, whom he frequently identified as Jewish. Lueger's genius lay in making anti-Semitism respectable and mainstream. He demonstrated that a politician could build a career on anti-Jewish sentiment while maintaining personal friendships with individual Jews and conducting business with Jewish enterprises. When challenged about this contradiction, Lueger famously said that he would decide who was a Jew. It was anti-Semitism as political strategy rather than personal conviction. Hitler later wrote in Mein Kampf that Lueger was one of the greatest mayors of all time. What Hitler learned from Lueger was not necessarily hatred of Jews, but rather how anti-Semitism could be weaponized for political gain. Lueger showed that blaming Jews for economic problems and social tensions could rally popular support, even if the charges had little basis in reality. Vienna also exposed Hitler to a flood of anti-Semitic pamphlets, newspapers, and books. The city's media landscape included numerous publications that regularly printed articles blaming Jews for everything from economic exploitation to cultural decadence. These publications drew on centuries-old stereotypes while incorporating newer racial theories. They portrayed Jews as simultaneously too powerful and too weak, too wealthy and too parasitic, too clannish and too eager to infiltrate Christian society. Hitler encountered these ideas during his formative years, absorbing them from newspapers he read in cafes, from conversations in the men's hostels where he lived, and from the general atmosphere of a city where casual anti-Semitism was common. But even with all these influences, Hitler in Vienna was not yet the figure he would become. He was still a failed artist, directionless and frustrated, but not yet a political activist driven by eliminationist anti-Semitism. In May 1913, Hitler left Vienna and moved to Munich. He later claimed he moved to escape the multicultural chaos of Vienna, but the truth was more mundane. He was avoiding military service in the Austro-Hungarian army. Hitler had failed to report for his draft physical examination, and Austrian authorities were looking for him. In Munich, he continued his precarious existence, selling paintings and sketching tourists. Then came August 1914, and everything changed. The outbreak of World War I electrified Hitler in a way nothing else ever had. He immediately volunteered for the Bavarian army, and his application was accepted despite his Austrian citizenship. For the first time in his life, Hitler found purpose and belonging. He served as a dispatch runner, carrying messages between command posts and the front lines. It was dangerous work, but Hitler performed it competently and seemed to thrive in the military environment. The contrast between Hitler, the struggling artist, and Hitler, the soldier, was remarkable. In civilian life, he had been aimless, unable to maintain relationships or build a career. In the army, he found structure and meaning. He was punctual, dutiful, and reliable. His fellow soldiers found him odd, someone who rarely joined in camaraderie, who didn't drink, who spent his free time reading or sketching rather than socializing. But they also recognized his commitment to his duties. Hitler received the Iron Cross Second Class in 1914 and the Iron Cross First Class in 1918, a rare decoration for someone of his rank. The Iron Cross First Class was typically awarded to officers, not enlisted men. The fact that Hitler earned it testifies to his performance under dangerous conditions. By all accounts, Hitler was a dedicated soldier who genuinely believed in the German war effort. His comrades remembered him as odd and solitary, but committed to his duties. For 4 years, the war gave Hitler's life meaning. He served primarily on the Western Front, experiencing the brutal reality of trench warfare. He witnessed massive artillery bombardments, gas attacks, and the senseless waste of life that characterized the conflict. Friends and fellow soldiers died around him. Yet Hitler seemed psychologically suited to endure this horror. Where others broke down, became disillusioned, or questioned the war's purpose, Hitler maintained an almost fanatical belief in the righteousness of Germany's cause. This psychological profile would prove significant. Hitler's absolute certainty, his unwillingness to question or doubt, his need to believe in a greater purpose, all shaped how he would later process Germany's defeat. Someone who could admit nuance, who could acknowledge complexity, who could accept that wars are sometimes lost for straightforward military reasons, might have processed 1918 differently, but Hitler was not that person. Then came the collapse. In October 1918, Hitler was temporarily blinded by a British gas attack near Ypres. As he recovered in the military hospital at Pasewalk, Germany was disintegrating. The Navy mutinied. Workers and soldiers formed revolutionary councils. The Kaiser abdicated and fled to Holland. On November 11, 1918, Germany signed an armistice agreement. Hitler was shattered. Like millions of other German soldiers, he could not comprehend how Germany had gone from apparent strength to utter defeat. Just months earlier, Germany had won major victories on the Eastern Front, forcing Russia out of the war and imposing harsh terms in the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. German troops still occupied Belgium and parts of France. Yet now they were told the war was lost, and Germany must accept whatever terms the Allies demanded. This incomprehension created fertile ground for conspiracy theories, and the most potent of these was the stab-in-the-back myth. The stab-in-the-back legend claimed that Germany had not been defeated on the battlefield. According to this myth, the army remained undefeated in the field, but had been betrayed by civilians on the home front. Socialists, communists, and most significantly, Jews, were accused of deliberately undermining the war effort, spreading defeatism, and finally forcing Germany to surrender just as victory was within reach. This was a lie, but it was a convenient lie for many people. German military leaders, particularly Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff, promoted the stab-in-the-back myth to deflect responsibility for their own failures. They had assured the German people that victory was certain, and they had pressed for unrestricted submarine warfare that brought the United States into the war. When their strategies failed and Germany's position became hopeless, they were the ones who told the civilian government that an armistice was necessary, but rather than accept responsibility, they blamed others. The myth took hold quickly, because it served multiple purposes. For military leaders, it protected their reputations. For right-wing nationalists, it explained defeat without acknowledging superior Allied military power. For those who opposed the new democratic Weimar Republic, it delegitimized the government from the start by portraying it as the product of betrayal rather than necessary political change. And for anti-Semites, it provided confirmation of their darkest suspicions about Jewish disloyalty. The emotional appeal of the stab-in-the-back myth cannot be overstated. German soldiers had endured 4 years of unimaginable hardship. They had seen friends die, had lived in trenches filled with mud and rats, had survived poison gas and artillery barrages. They had been told repeatedly that their sacrifices were meaningful, that Germany would prevail, that victory justified everything. And then, suddenly, it was over, and they had lost. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. The stab-in-the-back myth resolved that dissonance. It allowed soldiers and their families to believe that the sacrifices had not been in vain, that the military had performed nobly, and that defeat resulted not from the army's failures, but from treachery at home. This narrative was psychologically necessary for many Germans, accepting the reality that Germany had simply been outfought by the combined forces of France, Britain, Russia, and eventually the United States, would have meant accepting that millions had died for nothing. The myth allowed people to preserve meaning in catastrophe. The stab-in-the-back myth was particularly effective because it played on existing prejudices. In October 1916, the German military had conducted a census of Jewish soldiers, the Judenzählung, supposedly to document that Jews were avoiding frontline service. The census actually proved the opposite. Jewish Germans served in proportion to their population and were well represented in combat units. The military suppressed the results, but rumors persisted that Jews were shirking military duty and profiting from the war through black market activities. These accusations were false. Approximately 100,000 Jewish soldiers served in the German and Austro-Hungarian armies. About 12,000 died in combat. They fought loyally for their countries, but facts mattered less than narratives. And the narrative that took hold was one of Jewish betrayal. Hitler embraced the stab-in-the-back myth completely. It explained everything. Germany had not failed. Germany had been betrayed. The war effort had not collapsed due to military mistakes, exhausted resources, or the overwhelming power of the Allies. Instead, internal enemies had sabotaged the nation from within, and the primary internal enemy, in this view, was the Jews. This was the crucial turning point. After the war, Hitler remained in the army briefly as Germany's military sorted out its post-war structure. He was assigned to an army unit in Munich, responsible for monitoring political groups and conducting anti-communist education for returning soldiers. In this capacity, Hitler discovered he had a talent for public speaking. He could hold an audience's attention, stir emotions, and move people with his words. In September 1919, Hitler was ordered to investigate a small political group called the German Workers' Party. He attended a meeting and ended up arguing with another attendee about Bavarian separatism. His passionate speech impressed the party's leaders, and they invited him to join. Hitler accepted and quickly became the group's most effective spokesman. The German Workers' Party would soon be reorganized and renamed the National Socialist German Workers' Party, the NSDAP, or Nazi Party. It was during this period, from late 1918 through 1920, that Hitler's anti-Semitism moved from ambient prejudice to central ideological conviction. Several factors converged to push him in this direction. First, the chaos of post-war Germany seemed to confirm his suspicions. The war had ended with Germany in upheaval. Revolution broke out in multiple cities. In Munich, a Soviet-style republic was briefly established in April 1919, before being violently crushed by right-wing paramilitary units. Several of the leaders of this revolutionary government were Jewish, including Kurt Eisner and Gustav Landauer. For anti-Semites, this was proof of Jewish involvement in undermining Germany. The Bavarian Soviet Republic lasted barely a month, from April 6th to May 3rd, 1919. It was chaotic, ineffectual, and ultimately tragic. When right-wing Freikorps units and regular army troops retook Munich, they carried out brutal reprisals. Hundreds of people were executed, often on the flimsiest suspicions of communist sympathies. The violence scarred Munich's political culture and radicalized both left and right. For Hitler and others like him, the crucial fact was not the revolution's failure, but the visibility of Jewish names among its leaders. Kurt Eisner had been a journalist and political activist who briefly served as minister-president of Bavaria before being shot by a right-wing extremist in February 1919. Gustav Landauer was a writer and anarchist philosopher who served in the Soviet Republic's government and was murdered by Freikorps soldiers after its fall. Eugène Leviné, another revolutionary leader, was tried and executed. The fact that most Jews had not supported the revolution, that many Jewish leaders opposed it, and that thousands of Jews had fought and died for Germany during the war was irrelevant. A handful of Jewish revolutionaries became, in anti-Semitic propaganda, evidence of a vast Jewish conspiracy. This was the pattern that would repeat throughout Hitler's rise. Cherry-picking individual examples, ignoring contrary evidence, and constructing grand theories of Jewish conspiracy from selective facts. Second, the Treaty of Versailles, signed in June 1919, imposed harsh terms on Germany. The treaty assigned war guilt to Germany, demanded massive reparations, stripped Germany of territory and colonies, and severely limited the size of the German military. For German nationalists, the treaty was a humiliation. It confirmed that Germany had lost not just the war, but its status as a great power. Anti-Semitic propagandists seized on the fact that some Jewish individuals had been involved in the peace negotiations and in the German government that signed the treaty. They portrayed the treaty not as the result of military defeat, but as a Jewish orchestrated surrender. Once again, facts were subordinated to narrative. The treaty's terms were primarily determined by the victorious Allies, particularly France, which sought security against future German aggression. But in the world of conspiracy thinking, Jewish financial and political power had betrayed Germany to its enemies. Third, Germany's post-war economy was in shambles. Millions of soldiers returned to find unemployment, food shortages, and spiraling inflation. The German mark, which had been stable before the war, began to lose value rapidly. By 1923, hyperinflation had destroyed the currency entirely, wiping out the savings of the middle class and creating widespread misery. While inflation had complex economic causes related to war debts and government policy, it was easy to blame Jewish financiers and speculators for Germany's suffering. Fourth, Hitler encountered more sophisticated anti-Semitic ideologists who provided intellectual frameworks for his hatred. He read the work of Houston Stewart Chamberlain, a British-born writer who argued that history was fundamentally a struggle between races, with Germans representing the highest form of humanity, and Jews representing a parasitic race that corrupted superior peoples. He absorbed the ideas of Alfred Rosenberg, a Baltic German who promoted theories about Jewish world conspiracy and the connections between Jews and Bolshevism. Chamberlain's work, particularly his massive book The Foundations of the 19th Century, had been highly influential in German intellectual circles before the war. Chamberlain argued that Western civilization was created by the Aryan race and threatened by racial mixing, particularly with Jews. He portrayed history as a cosmic struggle between creative, noble Aryans and destructive, materialistic Jews. When Hitler met the elderly Chamberlain in 1923, the older man was deeply impressed by the young politician, recognizing in Hitler someone who would carry his racial theories into practice. Rosenberg brought a different emphasis. He focused particularly on what he called Jewish Bolshevism, the supposed connection between Jews and communist revolution. Rosenberg had fled the Russian Revolution and brought with him a conviction that communism was essentially a Jewish movement designed to destroy Christian civilization. He introduced Hitler to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, a fraudulent document purporting to describe a Jewish plan for world domination. Though the protocols had been exposed as a forgery, anti-Semites continued to cite them as evidence of Jewish conspiracy. Hitler also encountered racial theories influenced by social Darwinism, the misapplication of Darwin's evolutionary biology to human societies. These theories suggested that races were in constant competition, that the strong must dominate the weak, and that racial purity determined national strength. This pseudo-scientific racism gave Hitler's prejudices an intellectual veneer, making them seem like objective facts rather than bigoted opinions. These influences crystallized Hitler's thinking. In September 1919, while still in the army, Hitler wrote his first anti-Semitic statement in response to a letter from a soldier asking about the Jewish question. In this letter, Hitler distinguished between emotional anti-Semitism, that led to uncontrolled violence, and what he called rational anti-Semitism. The goal of rational anti-Semitism, he wrote, must be the removal of Jews altogether from German society. This document is significant because it shows Hitler's thinking before he became famous, before he had political reasons to moderate or exaggerate his views. The letter reveals someone who had already moved beyond casual prejudice to systematic ideology. Jews were not just disliked, they were defined as an existential threat that must be eliminated from German life. The only question was method, not objective. By August 1920, Hitler was explicitly comparing Jews to disease-causing germs. In a speech that month, he argued that you cannot control disease without eliminating its cause. Similarly, he claimed, Jewish influence could not be combated without removing Jews themselves. This biological metaphor, portraying Jews as pathogens infecting the German nation, would become central to Nazi ideology. Hitler's anti-Semitism had several interlocking components, all visible in his early speeches and later codified in Mein Kampf. First was the racial theory. Hitler insisted that Jews were not a religious community, but a race, fundamentally different from Germans and other Aryans. This racial difference was supposedly biological and unchangeable. A Jew who converted to Christianity remained a Jew. A Jew who spoke perfect German, served in the army, and contributed to German culture remained a Jew. There could be no assimilation, no integration, no acceptance. Jews were forever alien. Second was the conspiracy theory. Hitler claimed that Jews were engaged in a coordinated effort to achieve world domination. This ancient anti-Semitic trope, popularized by fraudulent documents like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, portrayed Jews as secretly controlling governments, financial systems, and media to advance Jewish interests at the expense of other nations. In Hitler's version, Jews were behind both international capitalism and international communism, using both systems to gain power and weaken the Aryan race. Third was the cultural accusation. Hitler blamed Jews for what he saw as the degeneration of German culture. Modern art, literature, and music that departed from traditional forms were dismissed as Jewish corruption. The Weimar Republic's openness to experimentation in the arts, its relative social liberalism, and its embrace of urban sophistication were all characterized as Jewish influence poisoning authentic German culture. Fourth was the economic charge. Jews were portrayed as parasites who enriched themselves at the expense of productive Germans. Jewish businessmen, bankers, and merchants were accused of exploiting German workers and farmers. This anti-Semitic stereotype ignored the reality that most German Jews were not wealthy financiers, but middle-class shopkeepers, professionals, and workers. It also ignored the central role of non-Jewish Germans in the country's economic system. Fifth was the political betrayal narrative. Jews were blamed for Germany's defeat in World War I, for the revolution that ended the monarchy, for the Weimar Republic's democratic system, and for any political developments Hitler opposed. Jews became the scapegoat for everything that had gone wrong in Germany since 1918. None of these accusations had any basis in reality, but together they formed a comprehensive worldview that explained everything Hitler saw wrong with the world. They gave him enemies to fight, explanations for Germany's problems, and a clear program for the future. If Jews were the cause of Germany's suffering, then removing Jews would restore Germany's greatness. Hitler spent much of 1924 in Landsberg prison after the failed Beer Hall Putsch, his attempt to overthrow the Bavarian government. During his imprisonment, he wrote Mein Kampf, which laid out his ideology in explicit detail. The book is part autobiography, part political manifesto, and part extended rant. It's also the clearest statement of Hitler's anti-Semitic beliefs. In Mein Kampf, Hitler described Jews as parasites, as corruptors of culture, as destroyers of nations. He claimed they were engaged in a conspiracy to mongrelize the Aryan race through intermarriage and to seize political and economic control of the world. He portrayed history as an eternal struggle between races, with Jews as the eternal enemy of the Aryan race. Hitler also outlined his vision for Germany's future. He called for Lebensraum, living space, to be conquered in Eastern Europe, at the expense of Slavic peoples, whom he also viewed as racially inferior. He insisted that Germany must become racially pure by excluding and eventually eliminating Jews. He described a future Germany dominated by a totalitarian state that would mobilize all national resources toward racial renewal and imperial expansion. The book sold poorly at first, But as Hitler's political star rose in the 1930s, it became a bestseller. By the time World War II began, millions of copies had been distributed. Newly married couples received copies as wedding gifts from the state. The book's ideas became official policy. It's worth emphasizing that Hitler's anti-Semitism was not unique or original. He drew on centuries of Christian anti-Judaism, on 19th century racial theories, on political conspiracy theories, and on the economic resentments of post-war Germany. Millions of Europeans shared variations of these beliefs. What made Hitler different was not the novelty of his hatred, but the fact that he gained power to act on it. When Hitler became Chancellor of Germany in January 1933, he began immediately to translate his ideology into law. Within months, Jewish Germans were being dismissed from government positions, expelled from universities, and prohibited from practicing many professions. The Nuremberg Laws of 1935 stripped Jews of citizenship and prohibited marriage between Jews and Germans. Thousands of laws gradually excluded Jews from every aspect of German life. The violence escalated. On November 9th to 10th, 1938, during Kristallnacht, organized mobs attacked Jewish homes, businesses, and synagogues throughout Germany. Approximately 30,000 Jewish men were arrested and sent to concentration camps. When World War II began in September 1939, the persecution intensified further. As German forces conquered Poland and invaded the Soviet Union, Nazi killing squads called Einsatzgruppen followed the army, executing Jews in mass shootings. By late 1941, the Nazi leadership had decided on what they called the final solution: the systematic murder of all European Jews. Death camps were constructed at Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, and other locations. Jews from across occupied Europe were transported to these facilities, where most were killed immediately in gas chambers. By the time the war ended in 1945, approximately 6 million Jews had been murdered. This outcome was not inevitable. Many paths led from Hitler's early prejudices to the Holocaust, and at numerous points different decisions could have been made. But the ideological foundation was laid in those crucial years between 1918 and 1923, when Hitler's anti-Semitism moved from prejudice to political conviction to eliminationist program. Understanding why Hitler hated Jews requires understanding that there was no single reason, no single cause. His anti-Semitism emerged from a combination of personal disappointment, political opportunism, cultural prejudice, and ideological conviction, all taking shape in a specific historical context. Vienna provided the intellectual environment where racist theories flourished and where political anti-Semitism proved successful. World War I created the crisis that needed explanation, and the stab-in-the-back myth provided that explanation by blaming Jews. The chaos of post-war Germany seemed to confirm the theory, making anti-Semitism politically useful. And Hitler's own personality, with its tendency toward absolutism, conspiracy thinking, and scapegoating, gave these ideas particularly virulent expression. Hitler's hatred of Jews cannot be reduced to childhood trauma alone, though those elements played a role. It cannot be explained purely as political cynicism, though Hitler certainly exploited anti-Semitism for political gain. It cannot be dismissed as simple prejudice, though it drew on deep wells of European anti-Semitism. Instead, it was all of these things, amplified and radicalized. The question of why Hitler hated Jews is important, not because Hitler himself was important, but because understanding how hatred develops, how it becomes codified into ideology, and how it can be transformed into policy and violence helps us recognize dangerous patterns in our own time. Anti-Semitism did not begin with Hitler, and it did not end with him. The same mechanisms that allowed Hitler to channel prejudice into power, that allowed him to make scapegoating into state policy, that allowed him to transform hatred into mass murder, continue to exist. The answer to why Hitler hated Jews is ultimately because a particular set of historical circumstances, ideological currents, personal characteristics, and political opportunities converged to allow hatred to become first respectable, then policy, then genocide. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to our channel so you never miss out on more history documentaries.